Thank you. So first, I would like to thank the organizer for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here once more. So I will speak about some joint work with Pascal Collin, Laurence Wirth, and Harold Rosenberg. And the thing is that I want to understand some aspect of the geometry of minimal surfaces in the hyperbolic world. So I don't want to understand hyperbolic manifold through minimal surfaces, but try to understand something about the geometry of minimal surfaces in the hyperbolic world. And the main point would be to understand the asymptotic behavior. So before looking at finite volume hyperbolic 3 manifold, let me recall some facts about the case of the whole hyperbolic space. So in some sense, if you look to minimal surfaces in the whole hyperbolic space, you have some kind of lack of rigidity for the asymptotic behavior. What I mean by this is that if you take any Jordan curve in the asymptotic boundary of H3, then you can always solve the plateau problem. So you can always find a minimal surface which has this asymptotic behavior given by this Jordan curve. And this is due to Anderson. So in some sense, it tells you that you have a lot of way to go to the infinity for minimal surfaces, for minimal surface. And in fact, if you want to recover some rigidity result, like the one for the minimal surface theory in the Euclidean world, you may more think about the case of the Bryant surfaces, so the constant mean curvature 1 surfaces inside the hyperbolic space. Okay, so this is the first point. But in fact, you can also play with this. And for example, there is the work of Boris Koskonetzer, where he constructs some particular example of minimal surfaces with some strange behaviors. And for example, he constructs disks, minimal disks that are embedded but not non-proper in the hyperbolic space. And this is a thing that is not possible in the Euclidean world. Okay. If you want to recover some rigidity, you may also add some extra hypotheses on the minimal surface. And for example, there is the work by De Oliveira Filho, where he assumed the following hypothesis on the surface. He looked at the integral over the surface of the square of the norm of the second fundamental form, and he assumed that that quantity is finite. Then under that hypothesis, he proved that the asymptotic behavior of the minimal surface is given by a finite number of curves, of Jordan curve, in the asymptotic boundary of H3. And moreover, that curves are Lipschitz. So you have you can say something about the asymptotic behavior. So now the thing is that if you want to understand something about the asymptotic behavior of minimal surfaces in the hyperbolic world, you may think about other hyperbolic spaces, ambient space. And the case here is to look at the case where N is a complete hyperbolic manifold with finite volume and non-compact. And I will try to say something about the asymptotic behavior of minimal surfaces inside this type of manifold. But before that, let me say that maybe you want to know that there exist some minimal surfaces in N. So I can give you a first result, which is a theorem. For me, it's due to Ruberman. It's the first time I see this in the literature. It's the following theorem. You take S, a properly embedded surface inside N with some extra hypothesis. And you ask the question, is it possible to deform S in the way to find some minimal surface which is isotopic to this one? And the theorem tells you that, okay, you can do this. And in order to be sure that you get something which is really isotopic to the original surface, you have to assume that you have finite topology, that the surface is incompressible, and moreover, you assume that the surface is non-separating.
Does this have to be orientable?
The surface, I don't think so. I don't think so. The thing here is that I assume this because I don't want to converge to a double cover of the non-orientable surface. That's why I assume this. Because if I don't assume this, I have some result, but it's not exactly the one I want. Okay, and the thing is that because of the topology of such a manifold N, you have always such a guy S in a N. So you always have non-compact minimal surfaces inside such a manifold. The second thing is that there is always a compact embedded minimal surface in such a manifold N. I think it's more or less a consequence of the theorem explained by Rubinstein on Monday. But let me give you a proof of this, because I just want the existence of a minimal surface. I don't want to be something which is Hegardt splitting or something like this. So let me explain the proof. Let me make a remark first. The thing is that because to obtain such a thing, you can't do minimization argument directly. Because a priori, if you try to do minimization argument for the area, maybe the surface will escape to the cusp and disappear at the end. So what is the idea? The idea is the following. So you take n a manifold with one cusp for the moment. The thing is that you cut the cusp very far away. And the thing, now you have a manifold with a boundary, and the boundary is a torus. And the thing you do, you take a solid torus and you glue it to your manifold. Okay. But you do this in the following way. You keep the original hyperbolic metric, and you do something for the geometry on the torus. Now you have something which is compact. So you know that there exists some minimal surface inside the manifold. And the final part of the argument is to prove that, in fact, the surface does not enter into the solid torus. And it is like this. So the surface lies in the original manifold, and you have this. So now I want to be a bit more precise about the construction. And you will see something which is very close from the talk of Joel Haas on Monday also. OK. So first, let me fix some notation for the following of the talk. So I consider a model for any cusp. So this is the quotient of, in the upper half space model, of Z larger than 1/2 by two horizontal translation V1 and V2. OK, here is the hyperbolic metric, and I will denote by lambda of C the maximum of the lengths of V1 and V2 in order to measure the size of the cusp. OK, and as I said, I need to modify the metric a bit in the cusp. So what kind of modification I will look at? It's that kind of thing. So you replace the 1 over Z square by a 1 over psi square of Z. And psi, you assume it is non-decreasing. And you assume that psi of Z is equal to Z in order to glue with the hyperbolic metric. Why I assume that the function psi is non-decreasing? It's because I want to keep one property of the foliation by torus in the hyperbolic cusp. It's the following property. So you have this foliation by tori. And with this metric, they have a constant mean curvature. And the mean curvature is given by the derivative of psi. So because the psi is non-decreasing, it tells you that the mean curvature points up in the picture on the board. OK. So now, in that kind of situation, you want to understand how far can a minimal surface go inside the cusp. And there is a proposition, a kind of maximum principle, that tells you the following. You take sigma, a compact embedded minimal surface, in such a cusp with the modified metric G of psi. And you assume that the boundary of the surface is inside the torus T at the height 1 minus T naught. And the thing is that if the size of the cusp is sufficiently small, you can prove that, in fact, the surface never enters into the part where the metric is modified. So it stays below Z less than 1, Z equal to 1. OK. So, of course, let me just say that this constant that depends on T naught also depends on some estimates you put on psi. Lambda it was defined just before. It's that quantity. I want to measure the size of the cusp with this particular chart. V1, it's because of the picture, it's very small. V1 and V2 are two horizontal vectors that gives me the translation. Sorry, the picture is too small. Okay? Okay, so now with this in mind, let me give the proof of the existence of a compact embedded minimal surface. So you start with n and assume that there exists only one cusp, and the cusp is given by the quotient of z larger than 1/2 by the group generated by the two translations by V1 and V2. And you assume, moreover, that the size of the cusp is sufficiently small with respect to some constant given by the preceding maximum principle. And of course, in the preceding, I need to fix some function psi, and the function psi I choose is given by this, with this property. So the only difference is that I assume, moreover, that the derivative is in fact strictly positive, because I don't want that any cusp is minimal, any torus in the foliation is a minimal. And I assume that the function psi has some finite limit in order to be sure that very far away the cusp looks like being Euclidean. Okay, so now the thing is that you choose some L very large, and you cut the cusp at z is equal to L, and you glue the solid torus. And in fact, you can do this by saying that you modify the metric between z equal to L and L plus 1 in order to have z is equal to L plus 1 is just the core circle inside the solid torus. And the thing that you want is that the foliation by z is equal to a constant is still mean convex in the dz direction. So the mean curvature always points in the direction of dz. So okay, so when you have done this, the thing is that you get a new manifold which is compact without any boundary, and a metric that depends on the parameter L. The manifold is always the same, it's just the metric that changes. Okay? So the thing is now you choose a Morse function on this manifold until such a way that all the tori T of Z is in fact a level set of the Morse function. So this Morse function gives you some sweep out of the manifold, and the thing is that now you can compute the following quantity, which is just the maximum of the areas of all the level sets of the function f. The thing is that a priori that quantity depends on L. It depends on the metric. But the thing is that when L increases, the only thing that you can do is to decrease the area of some level sets. So if L is sufficiently large, that quantity does not depend on L, in fact. So now, using the Almgren-Pitts theory or the work by Kolding and Delelis, you obtain that there is a compact embedded minimal surface sigma in N tilde whose area is at most M naught. Another thing is that if L is sufficiently large, that surface is in fact inside the original hyperbolic part of the manifold. Why this? The first step is that as you have this foliation of the cusp by mean convex tori. So it tells you that sigma is not included inside the cusp. It has to have some point in the original hyperbolic part. So this is the first step. The second thing is that assume that you have some point inside z larger than L, inside the solid torus you add at the end. So you have points in the hyperbolic part, points in this solid torus. So it tells you that you have points everywhere in between. So the consequence of this is that because you have this convergence, you can estimate the area of sigma inside this part of the manifold. And in fact, what you get is that this area is larger than some C naught times L, where C naught does not depend on L. You have some linear growth of the area. So now, if L is chosen such that you have this inequality, you have a contradiction with the fact that the area is at most M naught. So you know that sigma never enter into the solid torus. But maybe it lies somewhere between z is equal to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But now you can apply the maximum principle, because you know that the part which is over z is equal to 1/2 has some boundary on z is equal to 1/2. And since we have chosen the cusp to be very thin, you see that in fact, sigma never enter into Z larger than 1. Let's finish the proof. OK. So now I know that I have some minimal surfaces to study in some sense. No. No, a priori, no. Because if it's incompressible, maybe you can find some, do minimization argument and find some minimal, compact minimal surface that are stable. But a priori, here, it's not stable. And in fact, there is some cases, if you consider the complement of a knot, for example, where you don't have any incompressible surface to minimize in order to find compact object. For psi, yeah. I need this because I don't want, maybe the problem is that maybe when I do this argument, maybe I can converge to a torus which is minimal with some multiplicity. And I don't want this. So that's why I need to keep the foliation to be min convex.
Right, my question is...
Sorry.
Non-decreasing or strictly increasing?
In that case, I need strictly increasing. Yes. But you know, I choose the function psi in order to work in that part of the proof. OK. So now let me go to the main result I want to speak about today. So N is still a complete hyperbolic non-compact three-manifold with finite volume. And you want to look at some properly immersed minimal surface inside the manifold N. So what you do, you assume that this surface has finite topology. So the topology is the one of a compact surface minus a finite number of points. Then, in fact, you have finite total curvature in the sense that that quantity is finite. And moreover, you have some Gauss-Bonnet formula that tells you that it is given by the topology of the surface. Why we have this? It's because of the following fact, is that we can control the asymptotic behavior of each annular end of the manifold, of the surface. In fact, each annular end is asymptotic to a totally geodesic 2-cusp inside the end of the manifold N. So let me say that a priori, the only thing that you know is the topology and the properness of the immersion. That's the only thing that you know. So for a person that looks at that kind of question and knows some results like this one in the Euclidean world, it's important to notice that here I only assume that the surface is immersed, because in the Euclidean world, when you want to prove such results, you need to be embedded there. So it's a difference. It's the fact that in some sense here we have less place in the asymptotic of the manifold, so we can do this with immersed surface. OK. The second thing that you can do with this property is that, as in the compact case, you can estimate the area of the surface. And you have this estimate that tells you that, OK, as in the compact case, you have an upper bound for the area of the surface. And one question that we look at the moment is, OK, we have this upper bound, but is it possible to find a good lower bound for the area? In fact, even in the compact case, if the manifold is compact, I don't know such a result. And in fact, with Harold Rosenberg, we hope to put soon on the archive the following result. So here I am with Harold Rosenberg. So you take N hyperbolic closed three-manifold. And you assume the following hypothesis, and for the moment we don't know how to remove it, that the Igart genus is larger than 6. Then if you have some, if sigma is a closed minimal surface, in N, then the area of sigma is at least 2 pi. But for the moment, we don't know how to remove this hypothesis. And the thing is that it's not clear at all that that 2 pi is, in some sense, the good value to find. A priori, it could be larger than 2 pi, and we don't have a good example where we can compute the area to estimate what kind of good value could be obtained in that case. Okay. So now I want to say the following thing. First, because of that expression, so you have some control of the possibilities for the topology of the surface sigma, of course, and you can look, okay, what is the simplest topology that you can immerse in such a hyperbolic manifold? It's the one of a sphere minus 3 points. And what can you say in that case? It's the following result. If you have a proper minimal immersion of the sphere minus 3 points in such an hyperbolic manifold N, then it is totally geodesic. You can't deform the totally geodesic example in something which is not totally geodesic. And moreover, as a byproduct of the thing, it is pi1 injective. So how you obtain this? In fact, what you do is that you lift everything as an immersion of the disk inside H3, a minimal immersion of the disk inside H3. And what you have is that the pi1 of the surface here acts there in such a way that F tilde is equivariant with respect to the action of the pi1. And because of the asymptotic behavior, each loops around one of these points act as a non-trivial parabolic element, in fact, on H3. And when you have such an action, in fact, it's due to Adams. What you have is that you have a circle in the asymptotic boundary of H3, which is let invariant by the action. And as a consequence, the asymptotic boundary of D, of F tilde of D, is given by this circle. So you know the asymptotic of the surface, and since this is a circle, by a classical argument, you prove that, in fact, F tilde is totally geodesic. Okay. So now what I want to do is to explain the proof of this result. Tells you what are the arguments of this and how you control the asymptotic behavior only knowing the topology of the surface. So the first thing you do is that we want to understand the asymptotic behavior. So we only look to the annular ends of the surface. So the thing you do is that you take one annular end and you lift it to H3. So you have some surface and you have two possibilities. Either when you do the lift, you get still an annulus, or you get a half plane. So in the first case, if you have an annulus, so the boundary is on z is equal to 1, for example, choose the normalization like this. So you can project this boundary curve on z is equal to 0, the Euclidean projection. And if you take a small circle there, look at the totally geodesic H2 with boundary this circle, you have no intersection between these two surfaces. But now what you can do is to let the circle increase, and what you get at the end is the following picture. You never have any intersection between this surface and this one because of the maximum principle. And so what you see is that the annulus is on one side of some vertical plane in H3. Okay, but now you can do this around everything, around the boundary, and what you see is that in fact your annulus is inside some solid cylinder. And because of the hyperbolic geometry, very far away, it's a very thin, very thin cylinder. So the thing is that what you can prove now is that such a minimal surface can't exist inside such a thin cylinder. Okay. So what you get is that in fact the picture is not the one of a cylinder in H3 in the upper L space model, but the emission of a half plane, and moreover, this immersion is periodic, given by the periodicity of the end. So you have this, but the argument I have done there can be also done for a half plane. And what you get in that case is that, in fact, the immersed half plane is trapped between two vertical planes in the upper half space model. So the picture is like this. So here it's a z is equal to 0. You have some half plane there, some immersed minimal half plane there with boundary here, and you have two vertical plane like this on each side. So what you see is that because very far away, the distance between these two surfaces is very small, you have some kind of C0 convergence to a totally geodesic plane. But the thing is that C0 convergence is not sufficient in order to prove anything about the estimate about the curvature, the total curvature of the surface. So we need to improve that C0 convergence. And this is the thing that I want to explain now, is how you obtain a better convergence than C0. Okay. So let me explain the tools that I will use now in order to do this. We are going to use the following lemma. So it's very general in the minimal surface theory. So what is the lemma? You take n a Riemannian three-manifold, maybe with boundary or something like this, and you take an immersion of some surface, a minimal immersion of some surface sigma inside n. So you have a first minimal surface inside n. Now what you take is a second minimal surface inside n, but in fact you don't take only one, you take a one-parameter family of minimal immersion of a surface S. So you have the first one, you have a second one that moves with the time. And the question that we want to understand is the intersection between these two surfaces, the original one, the first one, and the family. The first thing that we assume is that this intersection never occurs on the boundary of sigma or the boundary of S. We want that the intersection is inside the two surfaces. So the thing now is that you assume that you have some intersection at time t is equal to 0. It's really easy to see that, in fact, you have still intersection at time t is equal to 1 because of the maximum principle. But the thing that we want to do is not to know that there exists still an intersection. What we want to know is that, in fact, you can follow the intersection with the time. And so the thing is that what you obtain is that, in fact, there exists a C1 path gamma that lies on the surface sigma, such that the image of that point is always on the intersection at time t is equal at time t. And moreover, you can, of course, prescribe the original value at time t is equal to 0. So the lemma says that you can always follow the intersection on the surface sigma. So what is the situation where I will use this? So the situation is the following. So you are in H3, and you take in H3 a piece of a catenoid. So it's a minimal surface invariant by rotation around some geodesic, and you can, for the picture, assume that these two circles lies inside two totally geodesic H2. Okay? So the thing is that that piece of catenoid does not come alone. It comes with some foliation. You can perturb it on the outside and on the inside by catenoids. So in fact, what you get is some foliation up to some surface C plus here and some surface C minus here. And in the following, of course, I will say that that catenoid is the blue catenoid. For the following picture, it's important to fix this notation. Okay, so now you have some place here and here between C minus and C naught and C naught and C plus. So between these two, you can put a very small catenoid, which will be the green one. So you have a very, very small catenoid there. And the thing is that the distance, so still these two circles there and there lies inside two totally geodesic H2. And you have the distance between these two totally geodesic H2, which is some epsilon. And this epsilon is, in some sense, the size where I can do something in the proof I want to obtain in my problem. So I have some, it's not this, some slab of size epsilon. And if a minimal surface is inside this slab, I can say something about it. So the picture you can have in mind is the following one. So now let me explain what I want to do. So the thing is that on the left here, I have drawn the upper half space model. And I have my half plane, which is minimally immersed with boundary on z is equal to 1 there. And that goes to to plus infinity. And so I have the x-axis. And I assume, moreover, that this immersion is invariant by some translation along the x-axis. OK? And I have the y-axis that comes to me. And as I said before, I can assume that this immersion, this object, is between y is equal to 0 and y is equal to epsilon, where the epsilon is, of course, the epsilon just before. OK, so this is on the left part. On the right here, it's just the parameter space of that immersion. So here it's just the half plane. So now what I want to prove here. So I have drawn this picture for the immersion. So here it's embedded, but think it's an immersion. So here I have the y-axis. That is, here I have y is equal to 0. Here y equal to epsilon. And the surface is between. So the thing that I want to prove is that the picture is like this one and not like this one. So what I want to prove is that the surface is transverse to dy. And if you know this, then after it's classical to prove that you have some very smooth convergence to some totally geodesic H2. So once you know this, passing from C0 to C2, C infinity is very classical. So the thing is to prove that you don't have this picture. So the surface is transverse to dy. So what is the argument? Imagine that you have that picture and look at that point. The thing is that I can put here some blue catenoid there and there in such a way that I am tangent to the surface. So I take this minimal surface and I put it to be tangent at that particular point there. So the new picture is this one. I have my blue catenoid there, and it is tangent to E tilde at some yellow point here. So on the right, So on the right, I draw the intersection of the blue catenoid with the surface E tilde. So all the points on the blue curve lies also in the blue catenoid. The image of that points are on the blue catenoid. So this is the generic picture of the intersection of two minimal surfaces, in fact. And the generic picture, moreover, tells you that outside the blue curve, you have some pieces of the surface here that are inside the blue catenoid, and some pieces that are outside. And you go from one side to the other. So you have that picture. And because the two surfaces are tangent, you have at least two blue curves. So it tells you that locally, you see at least two connected components of the surface inside the blue catenoid. But a priori, it's just a local picture. So is it a global picture or not? If it's not the global picture, what you see is that you can go from one side to the other by some curve, and this curve is inside the blue catenoid. Its image is inside the blue catenoid. So it tells you that, in fact, you have some connected component of the surface that which is compact, and that lies outside the blue catenoid. You have that connected component which is compact and outside. So now, for the moment, forget about everything and just keep in mind that you have some minimal surface with boundary which is compact, with boundary on the blue catenoid, and which is outside the blue catenoid. So now the thing is that my blue catenoid does not come alone. I have my foliation outside. So it tells me that, in fact, this connected component at some points a bit far away from the blue catenoid. And so I take one point which is a bit far away from the blue catenoid. At that point, I can put a green one. So I can do this. I can find a point there inside that compact piece that lies inside some green catenoid there. Now I apply the dragging lemma. What I do is that I take this green catenoid and I move it very far away. And the dragging lemma tells me, it gives me a curve on the surface, on that compact piece of the surface. So I have this. But here I can go very, very far away, and here I have a curve that is drawn, but this is compact. So I have a contradiction. I can't, this curve would be proper on H3, and here it's compact, so I have a contradiction. So the picture is not the one I have drawn. The picture is more like this. I see two connected components inside the blue catenoid. Of course, they are compact because the immersion is proper. And as before, I can do the foliation inside the blue catenoid to find some points a bit inside, far away from the blue catenoid and a bit far inside the blue catenoid. Yeah. So this is the points P1 and P2 whose image are there and there. So what is the idea now? You take the point P1 and you choose a green catenoid such that that point P1 is inside the green catenoid. And you will use the dragging lemma to draw some curve there. So what is the move that you are going to do? It's the following picture. So you take your green catenoid and you put it in such a way that the red point is inside the green catenoid. What you do is you move your green catenoid to the left, 10,000 times the period of the surface. You go very far away. And then you go to the boundary. So here, the curve I draw is the move of the catenoid. And you can do exactly the same on the other side. You go very, very far away, you go to the boundary, and you stop at that time. So the dragging lemma tells me, OK, you have a curve that corresponds to that move on the parameter space, which is like this one and there. OK, so I have this curve. OK, so this curve has some image, and what I know is that because the image of that curve is inside the green catenoid, it's not very far away from that polygonal line that I have drawn there. So in fact, the image of this curve by the immersion is like this. You do the same for the other red point. OK. So what you can do now is to put some curve on the boundary of the parameter space here to join the two curves, the two green curves, and do the same on the other side. The thing is that because the surface is periodic and we are very, very far away from that part of the surface because I moved to 10,000 times the period, the image of that curve stays close to that piece. It does not come back close to this. I don't have any green curve on the boundary there. Okay. So now my green curve here bounds a disk. So what you can do now is to forget about everything in the surface, but keep just the disk. And look at the image of this. So what is the image? It's a minimal disk which is immersed and with boundary the green curve. And because of the shape of that green curve, you can estimate where is the image of that disk. And where it is, it's more or less in that gray part. You can look at this and say, okay, it's like this. What is important in the picture, it's what happened close to the center of the blue catenoid. The thing is that close to the center of the blue catenoid in the x direction, the disk, the image of the disk, is inside the blue catenoid, is not outside. So what you can do now is to look at the intersection of that disk, that minimal disk, with some plane x is equal to some constant close to b0. Of course, I assume that here the center is x is equal to 0 in order to. So you look at some vertical plane, and you look at the intersection of that particular yellow plane with the disk. Okay. And now the conclusion is a counting argument. You look at that green curve there. It goes from one side, from the yellow plane, to the other side. So the number of intersection of that green curve with the yellow plane is odd. But now take a point of intersection there. So it's some points here in the picture. And because I can choose this to be a transverse, no problem, that point is inside some yellow curve of intersection between the disk and the plane. And because of the picture I've drawn here, and the fact that the disk is inside the blue catenoid, I know that that particular yellow curve stays inside that connected component. And it goes back to the green curve somewhere. So what you see is that all the points of intersection comes by 2. So you see that the number of intersection is even, and you have the contradiction that you look for. Okay. So I think, in fact, I will stop there. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, well, if there are no questions, let's thank the speaker again. So we're scheduled to have a problem